Hello everyone! Before I begin, I just wanted to say how excited and grateful I am to be presenting alongside such fascinating work at DANSOX this year. And although I can't be there in person, I hope you enjoy what I've put together for you today, because I certainly enjoyed making it. So without further ado, I will start the presentation. Just share the screen. Okay, so in this presentation, I have drawn out some of the ideas that I grappled with whilst writing my undergraduate dissertation, and they are ideas that relate to these key themes of dance, movement, and inscription in a specific way. I'll begin where I initially started my research, which was with this photograph. And before I knew who was in it or who had taken this photograph, what gripped me about this image was a feeling of its contradictions. So the photograph captures a body suspended in midair at the peak of a jump, not just a little jump, one that required an enormous effort. And I think what is captured in this image is just a moment of absolute physical exertion. The dancer's feet are flung backwards, the chest is thrust forwards, and the head is thrown back and round through the spine in an arch. And the sense of movement in this photograph of dynamism is so forceful that its momentum could almost continue right in front of our eyes. At any second, the body could unfold, release its contraction, and land firmly back on the ground below. But of course it doesn't. It's a photograph and it's inevitably still. The movements preceding and succeeding this jump will always visually elude the viewer. These moments are not captured on camera, and the body of the photograph cannot move beyond the point at which the photographer's finger pressed the shutter. And yet to me it did seem to move. The image is not still or dead or stuck or inert. It seems to brim with potential movement, past, present, and impending. Granted, we don't see this movement, we don't have visual access to it, but I argue that it is felt and it is imagined. It hangs in the air alongside the body of the dancer and, crucially, in our own. And it seemed to me that the dancer in this photograph is somehow both still and still moving. And here we meet our central contradiction and the focus of my dissertation, which was to explore the ways in which an inherently still medium, photography, can represent an inherently moving medium, dance, and the ways that this, and to question, the ways that this representation complicates the ontology of each medium. So the body in this photograph is unmoving and flat and two-dimensional, and yet is very powerfully corporal. And I wanted to look at the ways that we can register this corporeality in our own bodies when we look at photographs like this. I think it is also important to note before we begin that this photograph is not just a floating image like it seems on this PowerPoint, but a material object that has aged and passed through time. So while the body of the dancer appears in some kind of eternal now, frozen in mid-jump, the body of the photographic object is itself historic. And this creates a sort of temporal to and fro between the image of the dancing body and the self-contained body of the photographic object. So the photograph moving in time itself preserves the movement of the dancer's sort of ecstatic jump for our contemplation today. And before we delve deeper into the ways that these photographs move and in turn move us, I will introduce the fascinating woman who anchors this study and is the subject of all the photographs I will be discussing today, and her name is Hilde Holger. Born in Vienna in 1905, Holger became one of the most influential proponents of radical free dance in Austria, and yet her career and contribution to modern dance as a teacher and as a dancer is one of relative obscurity. And I argue that this obscurity is in part due to the destruction and the displacement of her archive. So Holger was born into an Orthodox Jewish family, and following the Anschluss of 1938 was forced to flee Austria, emigrating to first India and then settling in the UK. The Nazi regime in Vienna prohibited Jewish dancers from performing and forced Holger's dance school into closure. And following this horrific departure from Austria, Holger's life and professional legacy, including Library books, notebooks, costumes, posters, photographs, costume sketches, as shown here in this slide, have moved all over the world. And so her significant contribution to the creation of modern dance forms in Vienna has been partially lost and certainly academically neglected. So my research attempted to re-establish Holger's contribution to the formation of free dance, and specifically focus on her work with contemporary photographers to capture and represent its forms and ideals within a broader context of interwar Vienna. And before examining the specifics of Holger's choreography and its photographic representation, it is necessary to examine this very context. So, at the turn of the century, Vienna was a society that nurtured an intense preoccupation with the body, particularly as a sign of metaphysical identity. In short, Viennese intellectuals at this time saw the dancing body as a visible and embodied expression of one's deep self, a self that they felt language could no longer represent satisfactorily. So this crisis of representation, specifically linguistic representation, is most succinctly exemplified by Hugo von Hofmannsthal's Lord Chandos letter, which many of you may have heard of and was written in 1902. The novel's protagonist speaks of the intolerable gap between language and the self, and is so horrified by language's arbitrary terms that he loses the ability to speak altogether. Lord Chando describes the translation of the experience of the self into words as a descent from total ontological unity to a breaking down into a series of parts, and then those parts again into other parts. In fact, he describes words like soul, spirit, and body as being so inept at representing those concepts that he describes them as crumbling in his mouth like moldy fungi. So early 20th century Austrian intellectuals like him, and also Wittgenstein and Freud, came to see language as an inadequate or limited form of self-identification, and so looked to the body to resolve this union between self and expression. So by the time Holger began to professionally dance in the interwar years, this crisis, these ideas of somatic metaphysics, fused with and spurred the development of free dance. Both spheres celebrated the body due to its believed capacity to directly express emotion. Friedrich Schiller, for example, put this belief well when he wrote that the most secret movements of the soul are revealed on the exterior of the body, suggesting that gesture is the most succinct and immediate means of communicating the soul and emotion, and that the soul itself was something that could be experienced, or rather was experienced physically, rather than through speech or through thought. This historically specific concept is summarized best by the word corpuscular, as written on the slide. This was a very significant word for my study particularly, as it dominated cultural, intellectual, and creative life in Vienna at this time. And it translates very literally as body-soul. And this idea of body-soul encompasses everything I've discussed already, the idea of movement as the most efficient means of accessing and expressing a person's inner self, but also goes one step further to suggest that movement can access an essential human self that is common to all people. Holger and her fellow free dancers' choreography claimed to have rediscovered a fundamental and atavistic movement common to all bodies, and which, when danced, was capable of moving a common human soul. One of the main purposes of free dance, therefore, was to evoke a universal and essential state of being through practicing these kind of innate, essential, natural movements. It's a big claim. And what do these soulful movements look like? Well, the choreography of Holger prioritized uninhibited gestures, and to do this had to break from her formal ballet training. The free dancing body was not restricted and disciplined in the same way that the traditional ballet body was. Instead of ballet's regimented foot positions, Holger's bare feet here, or rather here, are placed loosely and flatly on the ground, providing a wide base and a low center of gravity, the opposite of going on point in ballet. And while ballet forced dancers to perform near impossible feats which challenged the body's comfortable movement, free dance sought to work with the body, and particularly its breath, to restore rhythms that they supposed were natural. And the influence of Dalcroix's Eurythmics is very clear here. And here we see, in this image on the right, the dancer's arms flung upwards with relaxed wrists and without distinct placing. In fact, in this group dance shown here, the movements of each dancer merge together in a fluid continuum that obscures the ending of one gesture from another. A shared wave of rhythm flows across and through the bodies, just as the branches above their heads are pushed to and fro. And we can also see that free dance abandoned the tight corseting of ballet and opted for loose fabrics that allowed for soft bending and rolling motions in the spine, and also emphasized those very undulations as the dancers moved. Free dance also did not require accompanying music or the representation of a literary narrative for it to be meaningful. It formed meaning as a complete and autonomous vehicle of self-expression, and so did not require the elaborate stage sets and costumes that ballet did. And in light of these formal departures from how ballet was danced, free dancers required new sites more welcoming to these radical forms of movement. In fact, I think it was Isadora Duncan who was refused by Gustav Mahler to perform. Gustav Mahler refused when she asked him to perform at the Imperial Royal Court Opera Theatre. So, in light of not being able to form in those traditional institutions, free dancers found an unprecedented number of unlikely settings to practice their dance, such as the cabaret and theatre Fledermaus, variety shows, art museums, adult education centres, and public gardens. Holger specifically made her solo debut at the Secession Building in 1923 and proceeded to dance in numerous public venues throughout the 1920s, including the Hagerbund and the Bugarten. If ballet represented to Holger rather restricted movement, free dance purported to access the body's natural, unfettered movement. A critic, Hans Brandenburg, wrote that Isadora Duncan, who was a founder of free dance, he wrote that she had rediscovered the body and its natural expressive gestures. And in fact, Isadora Duncan herself said, "I did not invent this dance. It existed before me, but it was slumbering and I awoke it." End quote. So it seemed that the movements of free dance were not bound to a particular historical movement, or moment rather, but were understood as timeless and essential, nascent to everybody, and therefore readily available for the transmission of a timeless and essential human soul, or corpuscula. So I guess the question is, was this true? Had these three dancers really discovered a truly natural movement common to all humanity? I am highly skeptical of this, and in fact, I know it to be false. And interestingly, while Isadora Duncan claimed to have never taught her pupils a step, she also said that, quote, "It is not enough to wave the arms and legs in order to have a natural dance." This and the emergence of dance schools, of choreography, of notation in the 1920s complicates free dance's claims to an intuitive and unlearned movement. In fact, Holger's notebook entitled Choreographique, which I wish I could show you today, but I couldn't find my photos of, contains loose systems of notation, mainly line drawings capturing different sequential movements. So it seems that what constituted natural movement in free dance was in fact not natural at all, but rather was organized, constructed, and choreographed by individuals at that time. So this reality threatens corpuscula as a sort of idea, and the idea of itself as a form of movement that transcends time and place. Indeed, to apply a post-structuralist point of view, one could argue that the body itself is a socio-historical entity and cannot escape its own historical and social discourse. A unitary, sort of transcendent, out-of-time, essential human body in this view does not exist. And Mary Douglas, in fact, identified a very interesting relationship between the physical body as a biological entity and the social body as a surface of inscription. She says, "The social body constrains the way the physical body is perceived. The physical experience of the body is always modified by the social categories through which it is known." In other words, there was no natural gesture, only gestures inscribed with meaning specific to its cultural moment. Hilde Holger's dance was not essential or timeless, but rather was codified with the cultural signifiers of her historical moment in interwar Vienna, all of which permitted the viewer to read the body as natural, rather than sort of intuitively connect to it as a natural thing, because that doesn't exist. The free dancing body did not reveal a shared soul, but a semiotic plane to be decoded. And in this, Corpuscula's insistence on the body's ability to escape from discourse conceals a discourse in and of itself. And now, before I begin to decode some of the visual references that were inscribed into Hilde Holger's dance and movement, I would like to address the medium of photography directly. We're not around to see Holger perform, nor do I have access to videos of her dancing. My project is centrally interested in photographs and the ways that photographers at this time represented Holger's dance and created images that evoked and symbolize free dance's central principles. So, although a vast material iconography surrounded dance at this time, including painting, sculpture, graphic arts, photographs specifically proliferated, photographs of dance. And dance schools and individual dancers were known to produce photographic postcards like the ones I've shown you here. And these received vast circulation to the extent that arguably the majority of people in the 1920s encountered dance more through photographs than through live performance. And traditionally, these photographs of dance that I'm showing you now were taken in the studio in a conventional portrait form, emphasizing the dancer more than the dance. They're still, mannered, rigidly posed, and this is in part due to the camera's long exposure times during this period, which meant the subjects couldn't move. And here we see a sort of aesthetics of celebrity, I suppose. We see icons of favourite stars, mass-produced and circulated for collection. But now, owing to further developments in camera technologies into the 1920s, that created a new way of photographing dance due to A, longer exposure times, and B, the fact that cameras could be handheld. And here we see the very technologies that allowed Trecker and Fail, the two photographers, Frederick Fail and Anton Trecker, to take the photographs of Holger that we'll be studying today. And I'll go back to these to exemplify this. So the longer exposure times of these new cameras allowed the bodies to be captured in motion, providing just a more effective means of documenting free dance's particular gestures. The handheld nature of the camera also allowed the photographers to move out of the studio and to native sites of free dance. And here we see the dancers out in the open, surrounded by trees and grasses. And this ability to capture subjects in an outdoor setting really helped free dance because it allowed the dancers to emphasize their movement's association with the natural world and evoke ideas of natural movement. In fact, photography could achieve the illusion of capturing its subject naturally through disguising the production of its own images, and I'll explain. For example, when watching a live performance in a venue, there is a clear division between stage and audience, between elevated dancer and seated viewer, making apparent the explicit occurrence of a performance. When considering Fail and Trecker's photographs seen here, this explicit division dissolves. The viewer of the dance in these photographs is concealed behind the camera lens, and therefore the kind of existence of a performance is more concealed, or at least more hidden. The dancers within the photographs seem unaware they are being watched, as if the viewer has not been noticed, or indeed does not exist. It is as if their rhythmic movement would continue to flow with or without the presence of our viewing eye. The women in the group on the right cast their heads down and locks of hair obscure their eyes. They do not notice the photographer and appear totally consumed in their dance. The facial expression of Holger in the image of the left is equally absorbed. Her head advances upward while her arm drapes low by her waist and right leg, creating a pull in two directions, both up to the sunlight and down to the ground. Her finger lightly grazes a single blade of grass, which is sharply in focus, and no more than a meter away from the camera's lens. So despite this proximity, the figure is depicted in total union with her environment and her own body, and the presence of the photographer is not explicitly recognized. It is as if they're not performing, or at least the photographs disguise the performative relationships the dancers have with their viewer, representing them as spontaneous, free, and isolated in nature. It's as if we've stumbled just across them. And so the various aesthetic means that these photographs use to create an image of the body in total uninterrupted union with rhythm and nature marks a representative feat only possible via photography and the timely emancipation of the camera from the studio. It is also important to note that these photographs don't refer to any particular performance of Holger's professional career. Indeed, they represent only a small portion of Holger's choreographic interests. Although these photographs by Fail and Trecker stress the natural gestures of Holger's oeuvre, which were very predominant, Holger was also known to experiment with plastic materials and the mechanical as much as with the human form. So these portraits, one of her performance Golem on the left and one of her performance The Mechanical Ballet on the right, are examples of photographs taken to promote specific performances. Trecker and Fail's photographs serve a completely different function, and it is in comparing these two different types of photographic representation of Holger's dances that the distinctive interests of the photographs at the centre of our study can be seen. Our photographs are concerned with a more decontextualized body, a body in motion whose only reference is its own ecstatic movement. They're concerned with capturing an image of dance itself, as opposed to any individual dancer or any individual performance. For example, in this photograph, we are presented with an image of a body totally consumed by movement and identifiable only by movement. The dancer's eyes are closed, limiting facial or verbal communication, referring the viewer back to the body as the site of expression and connection. Individualized features give way to the dominance of just the bodily shape. In fact, the face is obscured by quite a high exposure. And the banding and the lining on the dress also emphasizes this bodily shape, and we see a clear sort of sweeping line right up from her bent leg over her body to the very tips of her fingers. And this is a photograph by Trecker. And this photograph, I argue, does not seek to promote the career of the dancer or even encourage us to see the dancer as a specific recognizable individual. It instead employs the photographic medium to represent dance in its contemporary sort of metaphysical habitus as an expression of total self-referential embodied being. Trecker and Fail's photographs in this way should not be seen as supplementary historic documents which attempt to reconstruct specific dances of Holger's career. Instead, they serve to show the ways that photography helped construct and emphasize the image and the ideology of corpuscula, of a sort of body soul, to show, or rather they aim to show, a body that is consumed by its own movement. Now, having discussed some of the ways that Trecker and Fail used the camera's aesthetic properties at this time to emphasize these ideas of corpuscula, I'd like to move to some of the ways that meaning is semiotically inscribed into these movements and into the photographs of these movements, rather. What are some of the conceits, images, constructions, references that all work together to allow the contemporary audience looking at these photographs to read Holger's movements as natural? Now, links to the classical world were especially effective in evoking this association. In the sort of turn of the century Vienna, well, Vienna itself was very preoccupied and interested in the ideal Grecian body, thanks to the writing of Winckelmann in the century before, the revival of the Olympic Games in 1896, and the excavation of sites like Herculaneum. Now, the Hellenic period at this time was perceived by free dancers and by Viennese intellectuals as a sort of epitome of civilized harmony, and therefore could work as a general symbol of a sort of ideal and therefore most natural human existence. Greek and Roman artifacts, due to these excavations, started to emerge in contemporary visual culture and presented bodily figurations that sort of were contrary to these traditional ballet shapes. So we see sort of naturalistic poses in sculptures like Contrapposto that featured sort of more soft bending limbs. We see sculptural friezes, paintings on ceramics, which very often depicted sequences of movement, which seemed to suggest a sort of continuous flow of motion. And all these things found their way into free dance's gestural vocabulary. And Isadora Duncan, who was foundational in sort of creating that gestural vocabulary, famously went to the British Museum to look at all these Elgin marbles and Phidian sculptures and Attic vases a lot of the time. And now to look at this slide that I've got in front of you particularly, free dance also drew on neoclassical figurations in the style of the tableau vivant. In fact, I've always thought that the bending and leaning figures in Botticelli's Primavera here, and they're sort of shrouded in these kind of loose fabrics, I thought that was very reminiscent of the sort of softly inclining and bowing figures of Holger's group dance right here. And Isadora Duncan even described herself as donning her tunic and dancing like a dryad during her performances. In fact, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, who wrote Lord Chando's letter that we discussed earlier on, called Ruth Saint-Denis was a precursor to Holger and a sort of fellow founder of free dance. He described her as a primavera goddess of the wind. What she does with her body seems only possible out of an entirety of nature. We will no longer tolerate a message which is less complicated than that of the whole being. We want to read all the hieroglyphs. No, I just think this quotation is amazing and so useful, because in this single quotation, it converges specific references to the natural, the classical, the neoclassical, ancient languages, and the very process of reading dance, of reading meaning into dance and viewing it like a sort of language in that sort of semiotic process. And I could go on further to discuss many more sort of cultural references that go into the movements of these photographs, like the significance of Nietzsche's concept of the Dionysian. But I think for now I've illustrated enough of the sort of dense web of signifiers that allow these photographs to represent a very schematic construction of corpuscilla. And all that said, having just considered the culturally encoded content of these photographs, I'd like to point out its limits as an analytical approach when discussing photographs like this. Now, despite revealing the body's legitimate socio-cultural inscription, this approach in isolation privileges the textual attributes of these photographs at the cost of their corporeal attributes. So Mallarmé, for example, wrote that the dancing entity is always a symbol and never a person. And I believe that this dichotomy is false. Mallarmé finds that the status of the dancer as a body is incongruous with its efficiency as a symbol, and I would argue that these photographs of Hilde Holger present a dancing body that is both symbol and an undeniable physical presence. The image of the dancer, whilst holding symbolic meaning, is very embodied and insists on its presence as a body. It's not just a sort of passive surface wherein the body is strangely absent. And I think when the viewer encounters these photographs, the relation or the interaction is not solely visual or sort of cognitive, it's also sensual. And despite the two-dimensionality of the image, I think the body is still sensually registered. For example, in the jumping image that we've seen before, the viewer can see the tensile muscles of the legs tighten as they're held in position. In the image on the right, the high saturation of the light brings Holger's body to the forefront of the photograph's surface. Holger's extended fingers appear delicate and soft in the harsh light, and set against those sort of dark ferns and grasses, maintain a sculptural three-dimensionality. Holger's body on the left is shrouded in satins and silks, and their textures sort of glimmer and shine in the sunlight. The shadowy crease of a satin dress may reveal the rotation of a hip, or the billow of fabric might emphasize the movement of a leg. Trackett and Fell's photographs suggest a body, a vital body that breathes, bends, and exerts, its skin dazzles in the sunlight, and its hair tosses in the breeze. The movement of mass, of fabric, of flesh, of hair, and of light are preserved sensually within the photographs. And in this way, Holger's body in these photographs refuses a simple reduction to an emblematic figuration, and we are sensually aware of her body in these photographs in a way that surpasses sight and intellect. Now, this sort of somatic response from the viewer could be seen to affirm corpusilla's ideology. Free dance was believed to bring about a sort of symbiotic psychophysical exchange between viewer and dancer. In other words, it was intended to literally move its audience. The viewer was not only meant to recognize the spiritual state of the dancer before them, but also in recognizing this state, was believed to be able to sense their own bodiliness and consequently experience a shared physical state. So it would sort of spur a response of that kind of shared sort of corpuscula, that shared sort of unitary soul that supposedly we as humans all possess. I read somewhere actually that someone described at this time this sort of exchange as like a flash of lightning in its kind of immediacy, and that always made me think of the flash of a sort of camera bulb. Now this brings me to my final question, which is to ask, how do we account for this bodily response in the viewer? How do we account for the bodily sort of contagion that these photographs possess without affirming the false concept of a sort of shared and unitary sort of human soul? How do we explain this phenomena without affirming corpuscula, which we've proved to be a social construction? Now, in my dissertation, I drew on theories of affect and kinesthetic empathy to show how the qualities of the photograph and not the human soul compel the viewer to move. Their application affirms how theories of embodied viewing work with and not against semiotic analysis, and reveal the ways that Trekker and Fell's photographs benefit from combining these two analytical approaches to expose and explore fully the way that they construct a multisensory representation of corpuscula. Now, theories of kinesthetic empathy have recently re-emerged in academia following a scientific moment marked by research into the mirror neuron system. Now, this research was characterized by understanding the empathetic reaction in relation to movement, whereby the observer embodies a simulation of movement that it observes visually. So in summary, obviously in short, kinesthetic empathy sort of identifies a neurological process whereby our bodies can identify with and subsequently be moved by phenomena exterior to it. And in this case, those phenomena are photographic images. So in this way, the viewer not only identifies and sees the dynamic movement of Holger's body within the photographs, but in doing so, to a degree, internalizes it in their own body. And now, to understand kinesthetic interrelation between the subject of the photograph and the viewer more deeply, we must move from the sort of corpuscular-esque notion of direct emotional transmission to an understanding of the affective. Now, these photographs do not transmit emotions, by which I mean fixed, limited, cognitive sort of states, but rather open up the viewer to a more unfolding space of affects. So when considering kinesthetic energies, we cannot describe their impact on the viewer using discrete and identifiable emotional categories, despite what free dancers at the time may have believed. So we can't use categories like sad or happy, but they are better described as affective sensations. And although the viewer may kinesthetically identify with the moving body of Hilde Holger, the two bodies do not share an identical state, but rather exist within the same sphere of affect. And in this strict sort of subject-object relations breakdown and permits a sort of flow across thresholds and a fluid physical identification between bodies. And in this way, affect and the affective qualities of these photographs, they do not exist in one individual body, but in the relationship between the two. And this relates to D. Reynolds, her notion of the dance is body, so not dancer, the dance is body, which is an idea that sort of articulates the disillusion of fixed subject positions well. And she writes that the dance is body, she writes, involves movement among dancers and between dancer and spectator, rather than any individual specific dancer. Now, in summary, the effective movement represented within the photographs may be sensed in the body of the viewer via a sort of kinesthesia which flows between boundaries. Now, kinesthetic empathy is concerned particularly with the impulse towards or anticipation of movement. So anticipation of seeing movement is enough to sense movement in our own bodies through this theory. And it is by using this theory that we are allowed to address satisfactorily the powerful potentiality provoked by the suspension of the dancer's body in these photographs. For example, Helga's body, poised in midair, brims with potential movement, as we discussed at the start. And Fell's photograph allows the viewer to reconstruct and hold within that single image, as well as sense within our own body, the movement preceding and succeeding and including this pinnacle of the jump itself, the run up over the grass, the tucking of the legs, the extension of the back, and then afterwards the subsequent relaxation of the muscles and the body's return to the ground. Now, whereas in live performance, where we are presented with continuous and actual movement in real life, photography in its stillness concentrates this continuous imagined movement into one intensified image, compressing it spatially and temporally. In live dance, movement is endlessly disappearing, and the photograph disrupts this sort of natural fluid viewing experience and freezes the dancer's movement at its most ecstatic point in this case, in all its sort of trembling dynamism. The body in this photograph in the center transcends the spatial and the temporal, shimmering with dance present, past, and imagined, and held by the photograph in this sort of totally physically emphatic form. And in this way, I believe that Trekker and Fell's photographs embolden and emphasize Holger's movement as opposed to sort of flattening it and inhibiting it, although obviously it is flat. What we are presented with here is an arrested moment of absolute movement, and the visceral sensation of which the viewer cannot help but physically register, blurring the relationship between the dancer's body and our own. Holger's body in these photographs and Holger's movement in these photographs are semiotically inscribed in a way which binds the body of this dancer and cultural notions of the natural and the essential to their very specific historical moment in interwar Vienna. These photographs also evoke a very real, a very lived, and a very somatic response in the viewer due to their affective and kinesthetic qualities. Now, it is within these sort of threads of affect and thought that the photograph can most effectively meet the needs of free dance's ideology at this time. That is to say that whilst they do not affirm the reality of corpuscular, the body's multi-textural and multi-sensory representation mimics the same concept of corpuscular, so that the body of the viewer not only witnesses and reads a photographic construction of corpuscular, but is implicated physically within this construction. The cognitive associations, the signifiers, visually recognized in the dancer's body, and the physical sensations felt within the viewer's body merge to create a photographic illusion of this unitary oneness advocated by free dance as a cultural practice. And it is in the image on the right, now seen, that the implication of the viewer's body within this construction of corpuscular is made most explicit. Now, in other photographs by Trekker, the viewing body is absent from the frame. Like we said, it's behind the lens of the camera, although the viewer is still affected by the dancer's kinesthetic movements. We cannot see that viewer. However, here in this photograph, a shadowy outline of a body falls across the grass to the dancer's right. The curving line of Holger's body beginning at her foot, moving up to her waist and over her upper body, through her arm and to the tips of her fingers. This line is completed by the shadowy figure on the ground. Holger's fingers very nearly touch that shadow's head. The shadow of Holger's fingers, in fact, are a breath's distance from making contact with it. The shadowy figure is assumedly produced by light falling around the photographer's body as he captured the image. But considering its position and considering the position of the viewer before the photograph, the angle at which the photograph was taken, the body could just as easily belong to the viewer as to the photographer. The viewer therefore shares the same pictorial space as the dancing figure, sharing in its sphere of bodily movement. Where Holger moves powerfully, thrusting her arm back, the shadow is still and motionless, awaiting the moment of contact that will reconcile these two bodies. Holger reaches out, straining towards the shadow body. It is compelled to complete her movement, to share in her dance. And it is within this space, this gap in the grass, just beyond the dancer's body and moments from our own, that we are moved. On that note, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.